Miranda was an individual, Ernesto Miranda. We'll talk about him more in a moment. He had been arrested, subject to interrogation. He gave a confession without, of course, having been read his Miranda rights, which didn't exist at the time. His confession was introduced as evidence against him at trial, and he was convicted. And in Miranda v. Arizona, one of the outcomes is that that conviction is overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court on the grounds that he should have been read Miranda rights that didn't exist at the time. There were, however, also 3 other cases involved in this U.S. Supreme Court of Miranda v. Arizona. They're not in the title or citation of the decision, but they are discussed over the course of this case. So the U.S. Supreme Court had basically aggregated together 4 separate cases as part of their analysis and decision in Miranda v. Arizona. Now, about Miranda specifically, both the decision and the man. So again, this was a 5-4 Supreme Court decision handed down in 1966, and it ruled that an arrested individual is entitled to rights against self-incrimination and to an attorney under the 5th and 6th Amendments of the United States. 5th Amendment, right to not incriminate yourself, not be compelled to incriminate yourself, and the 6th Amendment right to counsel. Now, before Miranda, you had these rights, but they typically applied only at trial. They didn't apply pre-trial. In particular, they didn't apply in the investigatory or interrogation stage of an investigation. That's what Miranda changed. So at trial, you already had a recognized right that you could not be compelled to testify against yourself, and you had a recognized right to counsel at trial. What Miranda changed was it applied those rights to the interrogation stage of the investigation. So on March 13th, 1963, police arrested Ernesto Miranda on charges of rape and kidnapping after he was identified by a witness. This is in Phoenix, Arizona. And he was subject to a 2-hour interrogation, during which, of course, the police did not advise Miranda of his Miranda rights. There were no Miranda rights yet. So they did not advise Miranda on his constitutional rights to an attorney or against self-incrimination. And he ultimately signed a written confession acknowledging knowledge of these rights and admitting to crimes. Now, this written acknowledgement of his rights was really just boilerplate on the form. So the Supreme Court certainly did not believe that he'd knowingly, intelligently waived his rights here. This confession that he gave was introduced into evidence at court, and on June 27th, 1963, just a couple months later, he was convicted of rape and kidnapping, and also robbery. The judge sentenced Miranda to a maximum 55 years in prison, and Miranda's lawyer appealed the case to the Arizona Supreme Court. The Arizona Supreme Court reaffirmed the lower court's decision, arguing that the police had not violated Miranda's constitutional rights in obtaining a confession from him without the presence of a lawyer. From there, it went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court on June 13th, 1966, reversed Miranda's conviction. It held that presenting Miranda's confession, the confession obtained without him being informed of his rights, as evidence at his trial, violated his constitutional rights under the 5th Amendment to not be compelled to incriminate yourself, and the 6th Amendment right to counsel. Now, of course, Miranda was not beaten to get a confession out of him, which would be an obvious violation of his 5th Amendment rights. But what the Supreme Court does here in Miranda is hold that the in-custody environment of an interrogation imposes implicit coercion onto the suspect. And that's why their rights need to be read to him, even in the absence of physical coercion. The U.S. Supreme Court, in this Miranda decision, ruled that the 5th Amendment protects from self-incrimination and requires the police, for the first time ever, requires the police to inform the suspect about his rights, while the 6th Amendment guarantees the suspect a right to a personal or state-issued attorney. This whole state-issued attorney, by the way, an attorney would be provided if you can't afford one. That was also recent law. That was a decision just a few years before, the result of several decisions just before Miranda. This was part of the Warren Court. The Warren Court, Chief Justice Earl Warren was a very activist Chief Justice on the Supreme Court. Lots of criminal law changed during the 60s in America and the 70s. Chief Justice Earl Warren articulated that the court permitted confession or self-incriminating statements in criminal trials only. So it was only admissible in evidence when the suspects who made those confessions were deliberately informed of their rights, explicitly informed of their rights, that this was documented, and that they explicitly waived their rights, and this was documented. There were, again, 4 dissenters, so a 5-4 decision, and the 4 dissenters in a variety of combinations wrote 3 dissenting opinions, and I'll cover those in the 3rd and 4th parts of this reading of Miranda. So, interesting, a little history on this. After Arizona's ruling was overturned, the conviction of Miranda was overturned by this Supreme Court decision, the trial court again retried the case without presenting Miranda's purportedly coerced confession into evidence. So the jury never saw the confession in his retrial. And that jury in the retrial convicted him on the same charges. And he was sentenced to a maximum 30 years in prison. He didn't do 30 years in prison, though. Remarkably enough, he was released from prison after only 5 years. After only 5 years. And guess what happened to him then? Well, 4 years after that release, on parole, Miranda was murdered. He was murdered, stabbed to death by a man who, when that killer was arrested, the killer of Miranda was arrested, he got read his Miranda rights. What are those Miranda rights? 1, you have the right to remain silent. 2, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. 3, you have a right to an attorney and for the attorney to be present during interrogation. 4, if you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Those are the 4 Miranda rights that are famously known to most of us simply through watching police dramas on TV and in the movies.